hold you. You're all my heart beats for. All that I have to serve you, my life to praise you. You're all my heart beats for.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Sheridan if you haven't seen me before, and this is my channel, Rooted in Jesus. Glad to have you, and if you like this video, make sure you subscribe if you want to. But today's video is going to be me talking about my favorite Christian podcast. So I hope you can hear me since I decided to film this outside since it was a beautiful fall day. So I guess I'll just screen record and get into my favorite podcast. So the first podcast that I want to talk about is the Coffee and Bible Time podcast. I love the Coffee and Bible Time podcast, so that's the first one that I want to talk about. They're just so real and honest, and they have lots of topics that really help me in my walk with the Lord, and I love their channel, so of course I love their podcast. The next podcast that I want to talk about is Unfiltered Faith, and that is Meredith Foster. She's a YouTuber, and it's her and her friend, and yeah, it's really cool. They talk about lots of different topics as well, and it's just a really good Christian podcast. All of these talk about something different. They have different topics on there, and they're just really good podcasts that I really love. The next Christian podcast that I want to talk about is the Joyful Podcast by Cambria Joy, and I've followed her YouTube channel for years. Love her videos, love her podcast. It's so good. But I think you guys will enjoy that podcast as well. So the next podcast that I want to talk about is Georgia Brown's podcast, and it is called Faith and Friends. She has her friends on there, and they talk about faith-based things, and sometimes she just does episodes by herself. I really love her podcast, and it's just really good. Another podcast that you guys will probably have heard of if you're a Christian and you know who Sadie Robertson is. She has her Whoa, That's Good podcast, and I really love it. The next podcast is one of the first podcasts that I actually started listening to, and you might have heard of it too. It is Kirby Minix, her Bought and Beloved podcast. I really love it. It's super good. She digs into the Word of God really well in her podcast, and I really love her podcast. Sorry if the angle changed or whatnot, but my camera ran out of storage. So what I was saying is, the next podcast that I would recommend to you guys is the Happy and Healthy podcast with Janine Amapola. And I probably pronounced her last name wrong, but I really like her podcast. It's not all Christian based, but she is a Christian, so a lot of them are, so I really like her podcast. Another podcast that I love is the Encounter Now podcast, and that is Chelsea, Hursk, and Nick, and their husband and wife, and they have a podcast, and it's really good. And that was also another one of the first podcasts that I listened to, and it's really good. Another podcast that I love so much is the Have You Heard podcast by MMA Jenkins. MMA Jenkins is just such a ray of sunshine. She has a YouTube channel as well, and I just love her podcast so much. Another podcast that I would recommend is Jamie Grace, the Jamie Grace podcast. It's Jamie Grace's podcast. Love Jamie Grace. She's a Christian artist. If you haven't heard of her, her music's great, her podcast is great. Another podcast that I would recommend for you guys is the For the Girl podcast, and you guys have probably heard of it if you're a college student, because basically it's college student based, but I love their podcast, and it's really good. And we're getting to the end of this list, and another podcast that I really enjoy, I haven't listened to very many episodes, is The Hope We Hold by Jeremy and Ginger, and it is so good. And also The last podcast that I'm going to recommend you guys, oh, this is going to be such a shocker to you guys. The last podcast that I recommend to you guys is my podcast, Rooted in Jesus. And you're on this channel. I do my podcast, and yes, my podcast is not the best podcast, not the best quality, but I love doing it, and I like to add lots of truth from the Word of God in my podcast, and like to have lots of my friends and people that I really admire on my podcast, and hopefully we'll be recording season 2 soon. But my podcast is the Rooted in Jesus podcast, and you're on this channel. I post them on this channel, and they're available on the Apple Podcast. But I hope you guys got some ideas on what podcasts to listen to. Podcasts are very, very, very helpful, and I feel like they bring me closer to God, and they give me so many tips, and I really, really love podcasts. But if you guys like this video, give it a like, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video. I love you guys so, so much. Bye!